Nobody remembers the name of the backup pilot. Not until the primary one can't fly. For 2 years, Nathan Coleman sat in the corner of every briefing room at Shaw Air Force Base. Third chair, unassigned, unspoken to. They called him the standby. Nobody called him Talone. Not anymore. The heat off the tarmac shimmered around the F-16s like something alive. Jet fuel and hot rubber hung thick in the air. Coleman stood at the edge of the flight line, arms crossed, watching another pilot, younger, louder, already a legend in his own head, walk the pre-flight checklist like it bored him. "You still here, Coleman?" the pilot said without looking over. "Thought they'd have benched you permanent by now." Coleman didn't answer. He never did. He just watched the sky the way some men watch a door they know is going to open eventually. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from, hit that subscribe button, and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. Now let's get into it. His call sign hadn't been said out loud on this base in 26 months. It sat buried in a personnel file 3 clearance levels above the squadron commander's own access, a fact nobody at Shaw had bothered to check, because nobody had reason to. Colonel Frank Bishop ran a tight operation. Tight meant predictable. Predictable meant Coleman flew backup, and backup meant he sat in a cold cockpit on standby status while real pilots took the missions that mattered. "You logged 400 hours last year," Bishop had told him once, flipping through a folder without really reading it. "On paper, that's fine. But paper doesn't win dogfights, son." Coleman had said, "No, sir," and left it there. There was a scar along his left forearm, thin and pale, that he never explained. When people asked, he changed the subject. When they pushed, he found somewhere else to be. It wasn't shame. It was something closer to a locked door, one he wasn't ready to open for people who hadn't earned it. Today, the wind was wrong. He could feel it before the tower said anything. Somewhere out past the horizon, weather was building that didn't belong on the forecast. The mission briefing that morning was routine, an escort run, nothing that should have needed more than 2 aircraft and a clean flight plan. Captain Derek Voss, call sign Reaper, was primary. Coleman was backup, as always, strapped in a jet that everyone assumed would sit cold on the ramp for another day. Voss was good. Nobody doubted that. He was fast, sharp, occasionally reckless in a way that made the younger crew chiefs nervous and the older ones smile like they remembered being that certain once. "Try not to fall asleep out there, Coleman," Voss said over the comm check, grinning through his visor. "Copy," Coleman said. Chris Barrett, Coleman's crew chief, one of the only people on base who treated him like more than furniture, leaned into the cockpit before buttoning it up. "You good, Talone?" Barrett was the only one who still used the call sign. Quietly, like it meant something he wasn't supposed to say out loud. Coleman looked at him for a second longer than usual. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." Overhead, the clouds had started moving in a direction the forecast hadn't predicted at all. 20 minutes into the flight, Voss's voice changed. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was the specific, controlled tightness of a pilot doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Shaw Tower, Reaper 1. I've got a warning light I don't recognize." "Stand by." Coleman, flying 2 miles off his wing, felt something in his chest go very still and very focused, the way it used to years ago, somewhere nobody at Shaw had clearance to know about. "Reaper 1, say status," Coleman said. "Hydraulic pressure's dropping." Fust. A pause, heavier than it should have been. "Flight controls are getting sluggish, Talon. This isn't a drill." Nobody on the ground had called him that in over 2 years. It came out of Voss's mouth like a reflex, like something he didn't even register saying. Bishop's voice cut in from command, sharp and already too loud. "Reaper 1, do you copy? What's your status?" "Colonel," Coleman said, and something in his tone made the frequency go quiet for half a second. "I need you to pull a file." "Say again." Bishop's voice had an edge to it now, somewhere between confusion and the beginning of alarm. "Coleman's personnel file. Full record, not the redacted one." Coleman's voice was flat, clinical, the same voice a surgeon might use asking for an instrument. "You're going to need it in about 4 minutes, sir, and I don't have time to explain twice." On the ground, in the command trailer, someone pulled a keyboard toward them out of pure instinct before they even understood why. In the sky, Voss's jet had started to drift, nose heavy, the controls no longer answering the way they should. Talon, I'm losing her. I don't think I can bring this in. You're not going to have to, Coleman said. He banked hard, G-force pressing him back in his seat, HUD symbologists sliding as he lined up 2 miles out. Somewhere below, a file was opening on a screen that hadn't been touched in over 2 years, one with a classification marking that made the airman reading it go very quiet. Coleman didn't know that yet. He didn't need to. He already knew what came next. The airman in the command trailer stared at the screen for a full 3 seconds before he found his voice. Colonel, sir, you need to see this. Bishop leaned over his shoulder, and the color went out of his face by degrees. Deployment records that predated Shaw entirely. Unit designations he didn't recognize, stamped with clearance markers he'd never had reason to request. A kill count in a column that shouldn't have existed for a man who'd spent 2 years flying backup on escort runs nobody cared about. That can't be current, Bishop muttered. That's not. Coleman doesn't fly like that. But somewhere above the base, Coleman was already proving him wrong. He closed the distance to Voss's crippled jet in under 90 seconds, matching speed, sliding into position off the stricken aircraft's wing like he'd done it 100 times before, because he had, just never here, never in front of anyone who'd remember it. Reaper 1, I've got eyes on your control surfaces, Coleman said, voice level. Left ailerons binding. You still have partial hydraulics. Don't fight it. Ride it. Copy, Voss said, and for the first time all day, he didn't sound like the loudest man in the room. Barrett stood frozen on the flight line, headset pressed hard against his ear, listening to a voice he hadn't heard use that tone in years. Around him, ground crew had stopped moving entirely, drawn by the stillness in the air that comes right before something either goes very right or very wrong. Talon, this is Bishop. The colonel's voice had lost its edge. What replaced it was something closer to disbelief. I'm looking at a record that says you flew close air support in an engagement zone with a name I'm not authorized to say over an open channel. Is that accurate? Coleman didn't answer right away. In the cockpit, sweat had started along his hairline, but his hand stayed steady on the stick, correcting Voss's drifting jet by radio call alone, a foot at a time. Sir, he finally said, with respect, can we talk about my file after we get Reaper 1 on the ground? Somewhere below, Bishop closed the folder slowly, like it had gotten heavier in his hands. Copy that, he said. Talon, bring him home. Voss's voice crackled back in, tighter now. Hydraulics just dropped another 20%. I've got maybe 6 minutes before I lose the surfaces completely. Then we don't need 6 minutes, Coleman said. We need 4. He ran the numbers the way he always had. Not on a screen, not out loud, just somewhere behind his eyes where the math had lived since long before Shaw. Airspeed, descent rate, the crosswind starting to build exactly the way he'd felt it that morning on the tarmac. A runway that suddenly felt very short. Reaper 1, listen to me. You're going to fly this like the hydraulics are already gone, because in about 90 seconds, they will be. Trim for a flatter approach than feels right. When I tell you to flare, you flare. Don't wait for the jet to ask permission. Voss let out something between a laugh and a breath. You've done this before. Coleman didn't answer that. Some things didn't need saying twice. Below them, the runway crews were already scrambling into position, red trucks lining the tarmac like a held breath waiting to be let out. Talon Tower, winds are at 11 knots, gusting 18, crosswind components ugly. The controller's voice had the particular strain of someone watching 2 aircraft they weren't sure would both land in one piece. Copy, Tower, Coleman said. Reaper 1, 3 miles out. Gear down. Carefully, you might not get a warning light before it locks. Gears down, Voss said. A beat. Green light. I've got green light. Good. Now listen close, because I'm only going to say this once. Coleman's voice hadn't changed pitch since the warning light first came on. Not once, not even now, with a crippled jet drifting toward a runway with less margin for error than either of them would have liked. Barrett, still frozen on the flight line, would later tell people that was the part that scared him the most. Not the emergency. The calm. Nose up 2 degrees. Hold your altitude, Don't chase the glide slope. You've got sluggish roll authority, so don't overcorrect. Small inputs only. Copy. Small inputs. The two jets crossed the outer marker together, wingtip to wingtip, less than 40 feet apart. At 2 miles, the crosswind hit harder than forecast, shoving Voss's jet sideways in a lurch that made the whole flight line suck in a breath at once. I've got it. Voss's voice cracked just slightly. You don't, Coleman said, flat and immediate. I've got it. Copy my heading. Now. He slid closer, close enough that from the ground it looked like one aircraft shadowing another, guiding it down through air that kept trying to knock it sideways. In the cockpit, Coleman's jaw had tightened to a hard line, the only visible sign that any of this cost him anything at all. 1 mile. Gears holding, flaps at 40. You're on speed. On speed, Voss echoed, and this time there was something almost like faith in it. Bishop stood in the command trailer, both hands braced flat on the console, staring at a radar return that represented 2 men and 11 tons of failing aircraft closing on a runway that suddenly looked impossibly small. Half mile, Coleman said. Reaper 1, hold what you've got. This next part's on you. Somewhere below, the fire trucks began to roll. The runway rose fast, hard-edged, and unforgiving, the crosswind still shoving at Voss's jet like something trying to pry it off its line at the last possible second. Flare, Coleman said. Just that. No warning, no build-up, the exact instant it needed to happen, and not a second before or after. Voss flared. The main gear hit first, hard. A burst of white smoke off the tires that Barrett would swear afterward he heard before he saw. The nose stayed up a beat longer than it should have, held there by inputs so small they were barely inputs at all, and then settled, and the jet was rolling, decelerating alive. Reaper 1 is down, the tower called, voice cracking with something that wasn't protocol. Reaper 1 is down and rolling. On the flight line, nobody moved for a full 2 seconds. Then everyone did at once. Trucks rolling, crew chief sprinting, Barrett already running before he'd consciously decided to. Coleman broke off high, circling once before beginning his own approach. Alone now, the adrenaline that had carried him through the last 6 minutes starting to drain out through his hands in a fine, private tremor nobody would see. He'd flown that flare 100 times before, just never for an audience that mattered. By the time Coleman's jet rolled to a stop on the taxiway, Voss was already out of his cockpit, helmet under one arm, standing very still and staring at nothing in particular the way people do right after they understand how close something came. Bishop was there too. He hadn't been on the flight line in years. Not for a routine recovery. Not for anything that didn't require a colonel's signature. He stood a few feet back from Coleman's jet, arms crossed, that folder still tucked under one elbow like he hadn't decided yet whether to open it again or pretend he never had. Coleman popped the canopy and sat there a moment, sweat-soaked, hands finally allowed to shake now that there was nothing left that needed them steady. Barrett reached him first. He didn't say anything. He just stood at the base of the ladder, looking up like he was trying to reconcile the man he'd known for 2 years with whatever had just happened over that runway. Talon, Barrett finally said, quiet, testing the word like it belonged to someone new. Coleman looked down at him and almost smiled. Don't start. Behind them, Bishop hadn't moved. He was still holding the folder, still hadn't opened his mouth. Voss crossed the tarmac in long strides, still pale, still not quite steady on his feet. He stopped in front of Coleman's ladder and, for the first time in 2 years, looked at him like he was actually seeing him. You talked me down like you'd done it 100 times, Voss said. Coleman climbed down slowly, helmet under his arm. Something like that. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting today. Voss studied him a second longer, then did something nobody on that flight line had seen him do before. Not for instructor, not for a general who'd visited last spring, not for anyone. He came to attention and gave a slow, deliberate salute. Around them, ground crew who'd stopped to watch went quiet, one by one, the way a room does when something shifts and everyone feels it before anyone says it out loud. Coleman didn't return it right away. When he did, it was brief, a formality, not a performance. Get some water, Voss, he said. You're going to need it before the debrief. Bishop, still standing at the edge of it all, finally opened the folder in his hands and read the first line all the way through. The debrief room was fuller than usual. Word had a way of moving fast on a base that size, and by the time Coleman walked in, every seat was taken and half the squadron was standing along the back wall pretending they had a reason to be there. Bishop sat at the head of the table, the folder open in front of him, untouched pages fanned out like he still hadn't finished reading all of it. "Captain Coleman," he said, not Coleman this time, not standby, not anything close to what he called him for 2 years. "You want to explain to me how a man with your record ends up flying backup on escort runs for 26 months? Coleman was quiet for a moment. "You never asked, sir." Somebody near the back of the room let out a short, disbelieving laugh, then caught themselves. "That's not an answer either," Bishop said, but there was no heat in it now. Just something closer to respect, still working itself out. "With respect, sir," Coleman said, "I stopped explaining myself a long time ago. People either look or they don't." The room stayed very quiet after that. After the debrief, Coleman didn't linger. He never had. While the rest of the squadron traded theories about the classified file none of them had actually seen, he was already halfway to the equipment room, peeling off his flight suit, back to the same quiet routine he'd kept for 2 years running. Barrett caught up with him in the hallway. "You're not even going to enjoy this a little?" Coleman almost smiled. "Enjoy what?" "Doing my job." "Talon, I know what I just did." Coleman stopped, looked at him. The scar on his forearm caught the fluorescent light for a second before he pulled his sleeve back down. "I've done it before, Chris. This time people were just finally watching." Barrett didn't push further. He'd learned 2 years ago that Coleman's silences meant more than most men's speeches. Outside, the wind had died down, the storm that never quite arrived drifting off toward the coast. Somewhere on the flight line, ground crew were already prepping the jets for tomorrow's schedule. Coleman's name, for the first time in 2 years, listed as primary. He didn't know that yet. He was still just walking to his truck, tired, quiet, done for the day. Coleman didn't go home right away. He drove the long way around the perimeter road, past the fence line where the F-16s sat lined up under sodium lights. Engines cooling, ground crews doing their last walk-arounds of the day. He parked at the far end, cut the engine, and just sat there for a while, watching. He hadn't planned on any of this. Not the file surfacing, not Bishop's face when he'd read it, not Voss's salute. For 2 years, he'd told himself the quiet suited him fine. That backup suited him fine. That some things were better left in a folder nobody opened. His phone buzzed. A text from Barrett. "You good?" He typed back, deleted it, typed again. "Yeah, just tired." It wasn't a lie exactly. It also wasn't the whole truth. The tired wasn't from a flight. It was from 2 years of being small on purpose and 1 afternoon of not being able to help it anymore. Somewhere past the fence line, a maintenance crew laughed at something, the sound carrying thin across the tarmac. Coleman watched the lights a while longer before finally starting the truck again. The next morning, the base felt different in a way nobody could quite name out loud. Coleman walked into the briefing room the same time he always had, expecting the same corner seat, the same silence. Instead, 3 separate people said good morning to him before he'd even sat down. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that had never once happened in 2 years. Bishop was already at the front of the room, and when Coleman walked in, he didn't glance up from his notes right away, but he did pause his sentence mid-word, just for a second, in a way that told Coleman he'd noticed. "Captain Coleman," Bishop said, once the room had settled. "You're primary today." A few heads turned. Coleman kept his face still, the way he always did, though something in his chest shifted at the word. Not pride exactly. Something closer to relief that had been waiting a long time to surface. "Copy that, sir," he said. Voss, 2 seats over, caught his eye and gave him the smallest nod. Not a salute this time. Just an equal, acknowledging another equal. The mission that day was nothing dramatic. A training sortie, low stakes, the kind of flight Coleman could have flown in his sleep 2 years ago, and still could now. But climbing into the cockpit as primary for the first time in 26 months felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the flight plan. Barrett ran the pre-flight checks beside him, quieter than usual, like he understood this moment needed room to just exist without commentary. "Talon," Barrett said finally, closing the panel. For what it's worth, I always knew there was more to you. Didn't know how much. Coleman looked at him for a second. Wasn't yours to know. Wasn't anyone's, really. Until yesterday. You gonna keep flying like it's still a secret? Coleman considered that, the canopy still open above him. Morning light cutting hard across the tarmac. I'm gonna keep flying like it's just flying, he said. That's all it ever was to me. Barrett stepped back, gave the standard thumbs up, and Coleman sealed the canopy, the base around him already looking a little less like the place that had overlooked him for 2 years, and a little more like the place that finally hadn't. The sortie itself was clean, textbook, even the kind of flight that would barely rate a mention in the logs. But something about it landed differently on the rest of the squadron, watching from the ground, knowing now what they hadn't known the day before. When Coleman brought the jet back in, the taxiway wasn't empty the way it usually was for a routine return. A handful of ground crew had drifted over, not for any procedural reason, just to watch him roll in. Voss was among them, arms crossed, expression unreadable in a way that mirrored Coleman's own more than either of them would probably admit. How's it feel? Voss asked, once the canopy was up. Coleman climbed down, helmet in hand. Feels like flying. That's it? After everything. Coleman looked at him for a second, something almost like humor behind his eyes. What did you want me to say? That it feels different, because people are finally looking? It doesn't. It just feels like flying, Voss. It always has. Voss studied him, then gave a short, genuine laugh. The first easy sound between them in 2 years. Yeah, he said. I guess that's the whole point, isn't it? That evening, Bishop found Coleman alone in the hangar, running a hand along the fuselage of his jet the way pilots sometimes do when nobody's watching. Not out of superstition, just habit, a private kind of gratitude. Got a minute, Captain? Bishop asked. Coleman nodded, not turning around right away. I owe you an apology, Bishop said. 2 years of one, if I'm being honest. You didn't know, sir. I didn't ask, Bishop said. There's a difference. I looked at a quiet pilot with a clean record and decided that was the whole story. That's on me, not you. Coleman finally turned to face him. With respect, sir, I let you believe it. Easier that way most days. Bishop studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that comes from finally seeing someone clearly after years of not bothering to. Well, he said, not anymore. You're not disappearing back into that corner seat, Coleman. Not on my watch. Coleman almost smiled. Wasn't planning on it, sir. Outside, the sun was dropping low over the flight line, gold lights spilling across a row of jets that for the first time in a long while all felt like they belonged to him. Word of what happened on the runway didn't stay contained to Shaw for long. Within a week, a summary of the incident, carefully scrubbed of anything classified, made its way up through channels, landing on desks that didn't usually concern themselves with backup pilots at mid-sized bases. Coleman didn't hear about most of it directly. He heard about it the way he heard about most things that involved him. Secondhand, offered quietly by Barrett over coffee, or in the raised eyebrows of officers who'd never spoken to him before suddenly finding reasons to. You know, there's a general asking about you now, Barrett said one morning, sliding into the seat across from him in the mess hall. There's always a general asking about somebody, Coleman said, not looking up from his tray. This one use your call sign. Not your name. Your call sign. Coleman paused at that just for a second. 2 years of silence had trained him to treat that word carefully, like something that could still get someone hurt if it moved too fast in the wrong direction to the wrong ears. Let them ask, he said finally. I've got a training flight at 0800. Voss caught up with him on the flight line a few days later, no longer wearing the careful distance he'd kept for 2 years as the squadron's loudest voice around the quietest man in the building. Can I ask you something? Voss said, and you don't have to answer. Coleman kept walking his pre-flight checklist, not looking up. Go ahead. That day, when the hydraulics went, were you ever scared? Coleman considered the question longer than Voss expected. Not for me, he said finally. For you, some. Fear's not the useful part, though. The useful part's what you do within 90 seconds after you notice it. Voss absorbed that quietly. I used to think you were just checked out, going through the motions. I know what you thought, Coleman said, without any edge to it. Most people did. I was wrong. Coleman finally looked over, something almost gentle in his expression. Wasn't your fault, Voss. I built that impression on purpose. Easier to carry a scar nobody asks about than explain it every day. Voss didn't push on the scar. Some things he was starting to understand, you let a man offer in his own time. That weekend, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, Coleman went to the small gathering the squadron threw at the NCO club. Nothing fancy, just cheap beer and louder music than the building's speakers were really built for. He hadn't gone to one of these in years. He'd always found a reason not to. This time, when he walked in, the room didn't go quiet exactly, but it did shift, heads turning with a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with rank. Bishop was there too, off in a corner with a beer he was barely drinking, and when Coleman passed him, the colonel raised his bottle slightly. Not a toast, exactly, just an acknowledgement. Coleman returned it the same way. Barrett found him near the back, handed him a drink he hadn't asked for. First time I've seen you at one of these. First time I figured I'd earned the right to relax at one, Coleman said. You always had that right, Talon. Coleman looked out at the room. Familiar faces, some warmer now than they'd been 2 years ago, some still working out what to make of him. Maybe, he said. Didn't always feel that way, though. Late that night, walking back to his truck under a sky finally clear of the storm that had threatened all week, Coleman ran his thumb along the scar on his forearm out of habit, the way he sometimes did when the day had been long enough to let his guard down. He thought about the 2 years of silence, the corner seat, the file nobody had bothered to read. He thought about Voss's salute and Bishop's apology and the particular quiet of Barrett simply showing up day after day without ever needing an explanation. None of it changed what he'd actually done out there. That part had always been the same, whether anyone was watching or not. What changed was smaller than that, and somehow bigger too. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. He didn't need the recognition. He'd proven that to himself a long time ago, somewhere far from Shaw, in places this base would never know the name of. But it turned out, standing there under a clear sky with people who finally saw him, it didn't hurt either. Monday morning, Coleman walked into the briefing room and, without being told, took a seat near the front. Nobody blinked. Nobody needed to say anything about it. It had simply become where he sat now. Bishop started the briefing the way he always did. Weather, mission parameters, assignments. And when he got to the flight roster, he read Coleman's name as primary without pause, without comment, the way it should have been all along. 2 years of standby had ended not with a ceremony, but with an ordinary Monday, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of ending Coleman would have chosen for himself. He'd never needed the applause. He'd needed the people around him to finally look, and now, for the first time in a long while, they did. If this story hit home, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what you'd have done in Bishop's position, and subscribe for more unforgettable military and aviation stories. We'll see you in the next one.